Okay, so just I'm gonna say sorry in advance if I start coughing loudly or if my voice starts cracking because I'm still recovering for a bit. So another thing I want to actually focus on is that we're going to be talking about connected cars. So what do I mean by connected cars? So for example, if you have an old, like a very old Honda Civic, and no offense to older Honda Civic models, which I actually like a lot. So I would still suggest you highly to listen to this talk because if you have friends or neighbors who have Teslas or some other modern connected vehicles, you can just come up to them and tell them, like, listen, just so you know, I'm way more safe and secure than you. So let's take a look at some of the content. So we're going to be going through statistics. We're going to be talking about why are API attacks so prevalent. We're going to do incident overview. Of course, we're going to talk about AI, and also we're going to talk about solutions. So let's start with statistics. So in 2023, we had some incidents, and they were categorized into physical and remote. So if I were to ask you, what do you think, where do API attacks belong in this case? Do they belong to physical or remote attacks? I would guess that your guess is as good as mine, and you would choose remote. But if we take a look at, once again, at incidents that happened last year, and you had to choose between short range and long range incidents, I'm curious to know, what would you choose, whether API attacks belong to short range or long range. So your guess, once again, is probably as good as mine. And if you chose long range, then you are correct. And in terms of short range attacks, we could think of Bluetooth attacks as an example. And also, if you're curious about where I'm taking all of this information from in terms of statistics and other things that I'll be talking about, there will be a separate slide for references. So now let's talk about some common attack vectors that were pretty prevalent between 2010 and 2021. So if you take a look at some of these automotive attack vectors that are ranging from Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, sensors, as well as mobile applications, keyless entry, and even servers, you'll notice that there aren't any API attacks listed here. They aren't listed here exclusively, but I know for sure that API attacks in 2021 attributed for just around 2%, which is not a lot, right? But if you take a look at what happened in the year 2022, you'll see that there were a lot more API attacks. Right here, they went up as high as 12%, and meaning that they are already in fourth place. So that's a big increase, right? So actually, in 2022, the number of automotive API-related attacks has increased by 308%. That's really an incredible number. But what do you think would happen in 2023? If this was, let's say, an on-site session, I would probably ask you to raise your hands or to write down your answers, just like out of curiosity to learn more about what you think. So actually, last year, API attacks reached as high as 13%, which may not sound like a big increase in comparison to the 380% jump that we had previously, but they went from fourth place to third place, which is still pretty high. So let's talk about why are API attacks actually so prevalent. So the first reason that I've noted here is low budget. Basically, if you have a computer, well, and if you have Wi-Fi, that's basically enough, you're set to go. Or you can use your public library's computer and Wi-Fi. That's another option. Secondly, they can be executed remotely, as we've already discussed previously, meaning that it will be a lot more difficult to catch you. And for example, there are other types of automotive attacks that require physical access. And also another thing that we have here is that no special hardware required. So once again, when we're talking about other types of automotive attacks, we have, for example, the relay attack, where you have to have specialized equipment and where you have 2 people involved. Then we have relatively low technical expertise needed. But I mentioned that sometimes, so it depends. For example, at times, you get lucky. You find a simple vulnerability. Other times, it can take you months, weeks. So it really depends. Other reason is tools, techniques, public documentation. So even if you're not a seasoned expert at the moment, there's a lot of resources that you can refer to actually elevate your knowledge. And another reason is that there are a lot of targets that you can focus on. So if you're curious about what I mean that there are a lot of targets, I will explain this in the next slide. So here's the overall API attack surface. So we have fleets, we have OEMs, we have charging stations, internal applications, mobile, tablet applications, web applications. And we also have data, APIs, and all of these fall under the umbrella of cloud, which also falls on the umbrella of servers and store data. So if we take all of this into consideration, it's safe to say that the attack surface is pretty huge. But for example, only when I started working at my current workplace, I didn't previously have any specific automotive related experience. So when I was just onboarded, I always thought that, everything that we do is just perform penetration tests, monitoring TARA and CSMS on a vehicle, and that's it, which is entirely incorrect, because what we also do is we also perform penetration tests, for example, on charging stations, on mobile applications. And previously, before starting this job, I never considered that this is essential, that all of these other surfaces also need to be secured. Now we're going to be looking at some of the incidents. So if you decided to Google, let's say, something like automotive API hacks, as simple as that, you would have hundreds, no, rather thousands of results out there. You could just spend days and weeks reading through all of them. And you can, of course, do that if you want to. I mean, I'd love to speak about all of the incidents together, but it would take us at least a day. So another thing that I decided to do is just include some of the most important, or rather interesting, API-related headlines that happened last year. So one of them is a popular ride-hailing service in Pakistan with over 10 million users was attacked when a third-party communication API was compromised. This led to customers receiving abusive messages and notifications. Sounds interesting. Another one said that API vulnerabilities in a German OEM's website enabled malicious data exfiltration. The third one said that security researchers published a detailed report highlighting 3 critical vulnerabilities found in the API interfaces of a charging station management system, allowing adversaries to access files uploaded by other users, bypass the required provisioning PIN code, and hijack a charger's OCPP connection. And the last headline said that a misconfigured API and the lack of proper authentication and verification resulted in the research being able to access names, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, tax IDs, and vehicle service ownership history of the OEM's customers. So it's safe to say that these headlines are at the same time pretty scary and also pretty interesting. So another thing that was popping up on my feed at the very beginning of this year, basically everywhere on LinkedIn, I was seeing that something happened related to Ferrari, BMW, Rolls-Royce, and Porsche. I would assume that you might have also seen one of these headlines hovering somewhere, maybe on Facebook, maybe someone shared it, but at least on my feed, this was basically exploding for at least a month. So if you haven't seen any of these headlines, well, it will be my pleasure to tell them, to briefly explain you about what's presented in them. So we have to firstly thank Sam Curry and his teammates for this incredible research. So what we're going to do, we're going to instead analyze one incident. So once again, this is something that Sam Curry and his teammates managed to accomplish, and we're going to be analyzing this specific incident. And I chose this one exclusively because I like that there were basically screenshots and very nice explanations of how everything was done step by step. So I included only some of the information. I didn't include everything because that would take us a bit too long. But I'm going to be mostly going through these steps and also quoting him most of the time. Okay, so first of all, what happened? So he said that after finding individual vulnerabilities affecting different car companies, we became interested in finding out who exactly was providing the auto manufacturers' telematic services. We thought it was likely there was a company who provided multiple automakers telematic solutions. So what he found out, there is a service named SiriusXM that provided telematic services to companies such as Nissan, Infiniti, Honda, Acura, Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, and also Toyota. So what happened next? They decided to explore this avenue, and they kept seeing SiriusXM referenced in source code and documentation relating to vehicle telematics. Then Sam Curry and his team proceeded to perform various scans. Then he said that during this process, we found the domain telematics.net and began investigating. From what we found, it appeared to handle services for enrolling vehicles in SiriusXM remote management functionality. So I hope that you can see, but he actually performed a specific search here, otherwise known as Google dorking, or sometimes also called as Google hacking. And in my previous penetration testing experience, this is also something that I've done quite a lot while just doing reconnaissance. So I highly suggest you to check this out as well. Then what happened next? So he said that after pivoting to this domain in particular, we found a large number of references to it in the Nissan concept app and decided to dig as deep as we could. We reached out to someone who owned a Nissan, signed into their account, and began inspecting the HTTP traffic. Then there was one HTTP request in particular that was interesting, which is the exchange token endpoint would return an authorization bearer dependent on the provided customer ID. So while fuzzing, we removed the VIN parameter and it still worked. It seemed to only care about the customer ID. So let's talk about what happened next. So next up, the format of the customer ID parameter was interesting, as there was a Nissan prefix to the identifier along with the CVTSP header, which specified Nissan 17Y. Then we changed either of these. When we changed either of these inputs, this request failed. Trying to be cheeky, we went for an obvious insecure direct object reference and changed it to the customer ID parameter to another customer ID. This failed and gave us an authorization error. So sadly, sometimes we have to fail before we succeed. So in terms of what happened next, finally success. So he said that hours later in one of the HTTP responses, we saw the following format of a VIN number. This VIN format looked eerily similar to the Nissan cusp prefix from the earlier HTTP requests. What if we tried sending the VIN prefix ID as the customer ID? It returned 200 OK and returned a bearer token. This was exciting. We were generating some token, and it was indexing the arbitrary VIN as the identifier. To make sure this wasn't related to our GWT session, we completely dropped the authorization parameter, and it still worked. So, sounds interesting, but once again, this is not yet the end. They decided to go more in depth. So what they did is, he said that we took the authorization bearer and used it in an HTTP request to fetch the user profile, and it worked. The response contained the victim's name, phone number, address, and car details. At this point, they made a simple Python script to fetch the customer details of any VIN number. And once again, this is not yet the end. We continued to escalate this and found the HTTP request to run vehicle commands. This also worked. We could execute commands on vehicles and fetch user information from the accounts by only knowing the victim's VIN number, something that was basically on the windshield. And also, pretty funny side note, when I was analyzing the screenshot in more detail, I noticed how many tabs there were open, and it's kind of reminded me of how many tabs I have open as well during work. Then At this point, we identified that it was also possible to access customer information and run vehicle commands on Honda, Infiniti, Acura vehicles in addition to Nissan. We reported the issue to SiriusXM, who fixed it immediately and validated the patch. So let's not forget that once a vulnerability is identified, and we need to also report it. So all in all, they were able to gather some confidential user data, but that's not all. They were also able to remotely unlock, start, locate, flash, and honk any remotely connected Honda, Nissan, Infiniti, and Acura vehicles completely unauthorized, knowing only the VIN number of a car. So once again, it's safe to say that just by looking at this one example that I gave you, it's safe to say that potentially, maybe in the next upcoming year, API vulnerabilities might once again jump to even second place from third place potentially. Now, of course, let's talk about artificial intelligence. So AI and API, what do you think about it? Let's just ask AI. So we decided to ask AI, how can AI be used to perform attacks on APIs? And it gave us quite lengthy, interesting answers. For example, they mentioned that we could do automated vulnerability scanning. They suggested us doing brute force attacks. They suggested us doing distributed denial of service attacks, API fuzzing, and so on. So it's safe to say that if I decided to also ask AI, hey, how can I do, let's say, API fuzzing? It's likely that it would give me a more in-depth explanation on how to perform these steps. So it's safe to say that it can be leveraged in many ways. So one thing is getting fast answers. So my guess is that probably most or maybe potentially all of you have used AI at some point and you notice how fast it generates answers. Another thing is endpoint mapping. Third one is identifying potential vulnerabilities. And the last one is generating malicious code or scripts. So usually, or rather sometimes when you ask AI to write a malicious script, it may feel sometimes reluctant, but if you tell it, hey, I'm just doing ethical hacking, I'm not doing anything malicious, it's likely that it will be like, okay, I'll give you the answer. So lastly, we have solutions. So I decided to include a quote from our own CEO, and he often says that problems are depressing and solutions are exciting. So let's talk about solutions that excite us. So the first solution that I included here is to educate yourself. So for example, you could check out the OWASP Top 10 API security risks, or you could go and check out API security university classes. Another thing is improved authorization and improved authentication. So if you combine these both, you will know who has access to what. Then we have monitoring, then we have performing penetration testing. And also when it comes to penetration testing, so another option is performing, let's say, vulnerability analysis. So when it comes to vulnerability analysis, this usually involves performing automated scans. And penetration tests are on a higher level because you actually pretend to be that malicious entity. So I would say that generally speaking, penetration tests give a higher advantage and you would get better, potentially more accurate results. And the last one is verify third-party providers' security compliance. So even if you feel that you are secure, you would need to try at least and verify that other providers that you are working with also have some security compliance. So what does the future look like? So it's very interesting because we saw once again that there was an increase from 2% to 12% in terms of API attacks. Then it was only a 1% increase up to 13%. So who knows? We're still almost halfway through the year. So a lot of things can happen in a day. A lot of things can happen in half a year. So it's difficult to say at this moment what the future will look like, but there's a lot of potential for API attacks to progress. And we already have discussed the reasons for why API attacks are so prevalent today. So in this case, since I don't have a concrete answer of what does the future look like, I know maybe The Simpsons do, but I don't. So I decided to try and ask AI how it imagines the future of APIs and connected vehicles altogether. So this is an image that it gave me, and it's an interesting one. It seems like there's going to be a lot of action. So these are some of the references that I included, and I highly suggest you to check them out. And if you're ever in need of, let's say, penetration testing, fuzzing, or other types of services, I would also suggest you to check out our company's page. Or if you have any specific questions, you can always write to me via LinkedIn because I'm almost always online there, or you can text me via the Slack channel, which is via Slack on the API Security University workspace, or just via email. So thank you for being with me. I tried to kind of rush through the slides. So this is a very broad topic, which we could be spending at least half a day talking about. So I'm here if you have any questions.
Agnė, thanks so much for your talk. That was great. We did have a few questions. Your last slide answered one, which is what is the source of your data? All of those sources were in the previous slide. And so that one is answered. I do have a story that leads into the next question, which is I was recently in New York City with a hacker friend who had a Flipper Zero. And as we were driving down, he was executing some commands so that the Teslas that were parked on the street would all open as their charge ports would open from that signal, including the Cybertruck. Obviously, that's more, fun and little to no impact. But what do you know of any other attacks that the Flipper Zero is capable of for car hacking?
Yeah, so in terms of opening Tesla charging ports, it's interesting because I was recently in a conference known as Besides, and we had one in Vilnius, and I was also talking to a presenter, and he told me how he would go around parking lots and just open Tesla's charging ports. So I see that there's a lot of people doing that actually. So in terms of other attacks relating to the Flipper Zero, so we had the, let's say, keyless entry hack. So one of my friends has a Hyundai E30, rather i30. And well, I read that the hack works like a charm on Hyundai's, and I asked him if I could try it out. So I was able to copy his key fob signal and just send it. So basically, I made a replay attack, and it worked like a charm.
Awesome. Yeah, much more impactful than just opening the charge port, right?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Well, I think that covers all of the questions. Thanks so